Dr. Logan Berner. It is such a pleasure to introduce you tonight, not only somebody who is an accomplished scientist, but also one of our own. So Logan Berner was born right here, born and raised in Juneau, and he began his academic journey just a few steps from where we're gathered tonight. And like a typical scientist, I think some of you were here when I introduced Eric Hood, and I made fun of him because I asked him for a bio, and he was like, "You know me." And I was like, "Eric, give me a bio. I need a bio," right? And he didn't, and so I made it up. I like went online, figured out a bio. Logan, in very sciencey fashion, gave me a bullet pointed list. Here are some of my accomplishments. But it was very like bullet pointed. I was like, I will write a narrative. And put those together, because I will create it. I'm not just do bullet points. Okay, so here's my narrative about you, Logan Berner. Okay, Logan began his academic journey just a few steps from where we're gathered here tonight. He graduated from the University of Alaska Southeast in 2007 with a degree in environmental science, an experience that helped shape the remarkable scientific career that followed. So after UAS, Logan earned his MS in environmental science from Western Washington University, where he began studying the impacts of climate change on boreal forests. From there, his path took him to the Woods Hole Research Center, one of the world's leading climate change think tanks, where he spent several years conducting research across the Arctic, particularly in northern Siberia. Logan went on to earn his PhD in forest ecosystems and society from Oregon State University, focusing on climate change and forests across the Western United States. His doctoral work was supported by a prestigious NASA Earth and Space Science Fellowship. For the past 6 years, he served as an assistant research professor at Northern Arizona University, where his work was funded by both NASA and the National Science Foundation. Logan's continued to deepen our understanding of the Arctic, forest, and tundra ecosystems. His research has taken him very far from his original home here in Juneau, Alaska. He took 5 expeditions to northern Russia, 2 to Finland. He went across Canada and Alaska. Over the course of all of this research, he's published nearly 80 scientific papers, contributing significantly to what we know about how northern ecosystems are responding to a rapidly changing climate. Later, about 15 years away from Juneau, Logan returned to Juneau with his wife, who his spouse accepted a position with NOAA. And we're very thrilled to have him back in Southeast Alaska. And we're very lucky now to have Logan working right here at the University of Alaska Southeast as an assistant professor of forest ecology, working just a few doors down from his original professor and mentor, which I think is really cool. When he isn't immersed in data or out in the field, Logan enjoys long walks and photography, mountains, and really just being outside, which makes Juneau the perfect place to call home again. And now, please join me, and yes, I'll give you that bio so you have a real bio. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Logan Berner.
Well, thank you so much, Dean Slocales. I will try to live up to the way you promoted me. And thank you all so much for being here. It's wonderful to have my family and my friends and my colleagues and my community members all show up tonight. It's really beautiful, both here and online. I think my parents are tuned in, and folks it's really but I guess one question would be, do I need this microphone?
No.
Can you hear me okay without that? Is that okay? Okay.
Yeah.
I
don't know.
So
Online.
the people online are fine because they have the pop. Which is yep. So
Can
as
they
long
hear
as
you?
people in the room can hear me without the microphone, I'll ditch this one. Can I give you that?
Oh, yeah.
No, you love the microphone.
I do, a lot.
So in 2021, I was invited to join a research expedition up into the Alaskan Brooks Range. So this was an expedition that was led by Dr. Roman Dial, who is a well-known wilderness explorer and biologist at Alaska Pacific University. And the purpose of this expedition was to try to understand some of the impacts of climate change where the forest gives way to the Arctic tundra. It's really a magnificent place up in the Brooks Range. So flying out of Kotzebue, I was dropped off on a gravel bar about 150 miles away along the Ambler River, where I met up with Roman and his field crew who had spent the last month hiking through the Brooks Range. Falling in with their crew, we set off, moving out of the northern extent of the boreal forest, heading northward, up into the mountains. Passing through the current extent of northern tree line, some of the most amazingly beautiful places that I've ever seen in my life. We hiked north, following caribou trails up into mountain passes. We worked our way day after day, after more days, and some more days, primarily in the rain. It rained for the first 7 days, and then finally the sun came out, and my colleague Pat popped his little head out like a groundhog and pulled out his socks really swiftly and hung them up to dry in the sunshine. And then we kept hiking, and eventually we ended up in the tundra. And at last we found what we were looking for. And that was little baby trees that had popped up in the treeless Arctic tundra, 30 miles or so from the northern extent of current tree line. And we didn't just find, one or two little trees, but we ended up finding whole new populations of trees way beyond the northern extent of tree line. And so Roman, shown here on the left, proudly holding one of these little white sprues that he ripped out of the ground, was very interested in trying to understand when these trees had showed. And so he meticulously went through and he dated about 1,700 individual trees and looked at when they became established on the landscape. And so the graph here shows that back in 1900, there were pretty much no white spruce on this landscape. By the time you hit 1960, so this is like a little watershed in the Brooks Range. By the time you hit 1960, there's about 500. And by the time you hit 1980, the population had increased exponentially up to 1,500, 1,700 individuals, right? So this is really the beginning of a transformation of the Arctic tundra into this treed state, a fundamentally different kind of ecosystem than what has been there for many thousands of years. And so tonight, I want to share a story about Arctic environmental change. And so this is a story that is partially based on the research that I have done, but a lot of it draws from the research that colleagues have done who are, atmospheric scientists, geophysicists, wildlife ecologists, vegetation ecologists. So it's a story that I'm telling, but it really draws upon this collaborative research that people have done working at institutions across the world. And so tonight, I'm going to serve up for hopefully your dining delight, a 4-course story. And so we're going to start with talking about warming and thawing. The Arctic's getting warmer very quickly and it's thawing out. We'll then go into how vegetation is responding. The Arctic is greening, trees and shrubs are moving across these northern landscapes. And then that, of course, is having impacts on wildlife. And there are winners and losers as a result of that. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with a kind of so what does this mean for people in the north and beyond? And what should we anticipate going forward? So the Arctic, there's a number of different ways to define kind of the Arctic tundra biome. But one way is shown here in this map on the left. So the shades of blue and orange are kind of the traditional polar Arctic, the areas north of latitudinal tree line. And then the areas in red, in essence, are the fingers of alpine tundra that extend out of the polar Arctic. But altogether, we consider this part of the Arctic tundra biome. And this biome in total covers about 6% of Earth's land surface. And it is, in fact, the coldest of Earth's terrestrial biomes, right? So if we look at all the different kinds of biomes in the world, from deserts to boreal forests to tundra, we find that the tundra is the coldest, right? On average, the annual temperatures barely break 0 degrees Celsius. frozen almost all the time. And it's also pretty dry a lot of the time. Right, and so because it is so persistently cold, the Arctic is underlain by frozen permafrost soils. So permafrost is technically defined as soils that have been frozen for at least 2 consecutive years. And as shown on the map on the left, there's different shades of purple. It expands out across all of the Arctic tundra biome. The figure on the right then shows this kind of cross-section of the permafrost. And you see that up on the very top, the active layer. So this is the zone in the soil that annually thaws out during summer and then freezes again during winter. So that's the zone where all of biology, modern living biology, occurs. And then the permafrost technically is the area beneath that. And that is the soil that remains consistently frozen. And because it's so cold, and through different geophysical processes, there are really large ice wedges that can develop within permafrost soils. And so, perhaps not surprisingly, when temperatures rise, those can melt out. Now, because the permafrost soils are so cold, over time, they have accumulated a tremendous amount of organic matter. So when plants grow, when animals grow up and die, they don't decompose very quickly. A lot of that organic carbon gets pulled into the soil, right? And just kind of locked away in the freezer, right? And so now these cold permafrost soils store about twice as much carbon as is currently found in the atmosphere. And so it makes what happens in the Arctic really important for life outside of the Arctic, because as it warms up, that carbon is being mobilized into the atmosphere, where it acts as a greenhouse gas. Now, with these large ice wedges and rising temperatures, there have been some very large, kind of abrupt permafrost thaw. So we see this increase in permafrost thaw, like retrogressive thaw slumps shown here, where in essence the land subsides really quickly as the ice melts out from underneath it, and then it runs off. And so as the sediment pours down the landscape, it enters into rivers. It brings with it huge amounts of mercury, for example, that have accumulated in these Arctic soils over time, mobilizing that into these aquatic food chains. But we're seeing this increase in permafrost thaw events in part because the Arctic is so rapidly warming, right? So the Arctic in recent decades has warmed 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. And the map here, based on data from NASA, shows the change in mean annual temperatures from 1960 up to 2024, with the darker shades of red being areas that have warmed most rapidly, right? And so you can see the darkest shades of red are primarily in these polar regions, right? Where temperatures have risen between 2 to upwards of 5 degrees Celsius since the 1960s. So we see this rapid increase in air temperatures, and perhaps not surprisingly, when people have gone and drilled holes into the permafrost, dropped temperature loggers down into the ground, and looked at changes in permafrost temperatures over time, as has been done at sites across the north, in essence found the same thing, right? So these are all different time series of permafrost temperature measurements from sites around the Arctic, going back varying points in time, just before the 1980s in the case of the longest records. And really across the board, we see all of them are going upwards, right? And permafrost temperature tends to, well, air temperatures fluctuate a lot year to year and might be tending upwards. Permafrost has a lot more thermal inertia. And so it doesn't show these large spikes on a year-to-year basis. It smooths out that warming trend and makes it this much more persistent pattern of change over time. And so things have warmed up to the point now that the Arctic is warmer than it has been any time in at least the last 2,000 years. So this is an annual temperature reconstruction that goes back to the year 0 based on tree ring data that have been used to reconstruct temperature anomalies across the whole Arctic, right? And so you can see that there's a lot of variability over the last 2,000 years. And then shown in red is kind of the most recent conditions, maybe 1900 onward, skyrocketing up to 2023 at the end of the time series. So this analysis ended in 2023. And they concluded, based on their analysis, that 2023 was the hottest year over at least the last 2,000 years. And then in contrast, there are some years that have really anomalously low temperatures, like 536. Any sense of why there are such low temperatures during some of those years? Volcanoes, right? Volcanoes are, right? So a lot of these really low points are due to volcanoes throwing up a huge amount of ash into the atmosphere and cooling things down, right? And we know fundamentally that this long-term warming trend is due to carbon emissions from human activities, right? So here's a time series of carbon dioxide measurements made at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, where folks who work at Scripps and at NOAA have gone out year after year, many times each year, collecting flask samples, report them up, analyze the CO2 concentrations in the air. And what we find is that back in the late 1950s, the atmospheric CO2 concentrations were down around 310 parts per million. And over time, they've risen such that now, when I checked, the most recent data was for August of 2025, it was up at 425 parts per million. So we've seen over 100 part per million increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, in a 60-year time period. See if I can do that math really quick. And then, we also see these little squiggles, right? Within each year, carbon dioxide concentrations raising and then lowering. We know why that is. Plant growth, yeah. Right, so there's this seasonal cycle where, in essence, this is the northern hemisphere summer, where plants have turned on, they've sucked down carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Fall comes, plant starts nesting, as the carbon dioxide goes back into the atmosphere, rises up, and year on, that cycle persists. But nonetheless, we see this long-term increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. And so there's been a lot of work to understand where this carbon dioxide is coming from. And it turns out that about 2/3 of it is due to carbon emissions from fossil fuel consumption. And then about 1/3 of it is due to land use, land cover change. Loss of forests. Sorry, I've got to lose a shirt, which I'm laughing. My wife was like, don't wear your heavy shirt. So I was like, I'm going to wear my light shirt and it's still too hot. If I wore my UAS t-shirt though.
Nice job.
And so fundamentally, right, we know that the planet is warming due to greenhouse gas emissions from people. But one of the reasons that the Arctic has warmed 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet is related to sea ice, right? So this image shows the extent of September sea ice in 1979. September is the benchmark window to look at sea ice extent because that is the annual minimum, right? That's when most of the sea ice is melted over the year. And so comparing 1979 to 2021, toggling back and forth, there's been about a 13% decline in Arctic sea ice minimum each decade since the 1980s. And as that sea ice has gone away, it's exposed dark ocean waters, and those dark ocean waters absorb a lot more incoming heat energy from the sun, which then gets re-radiated back into the Earth's climate. So we see this amplified warming trend in the Arctic as a result, in large part, of sea ice decline. Okay, so that's kind of a quick take on temperature and permafrost thaw. And so let's shift now into looking at vegetation. We're kind of the greening of the Arctic, okay? So altogether, there are about 1,700 plant species in the Arctic. These range from non-vascular mosses, up in the top left, to vascular trees, white spruce, shrubs like this dwarf birch, low-bush cranberries, empetrum, crowberry, sedges and whatnot, right? And you'll probably recognize some of these species, right? These are species that we have in alpine and muskeg areas around Juneau, right? We have cloudberries, we have low-bush cranberries, empetrum, right? Like floristically, our alpine and muskeg systems are Arctic ecosystems, right? Now, as you move from the coldest to the warmest parts of the Arctic, there are notable changes in ecosystem characteristics. So this photo is taken up in Bile Island by a colleague, Alistair Beer. And up in Bile Island, all the vegetation is very, very low lying. It's mosses, short forbs. It's very low stature, low productivity, low diversity of communities. And as you move into these progressively warmer areas, such as in the Brooks Range, this is maybe a little bit more forest than tundra. But in essence, you get more biomass, you get more woody plants, you get higher species diversity along the way. And so we have recently also taken steps to kind of quantify this a little bit more than just showing photos. And so in a study that my colleague and I and 50 other people from countries around the world published last year, we in essence went out and mapped the extent, the amount and composition of living plants across the Arctic at about 100-foot by 100-foot resolution by combining a huge stack of satellite images from Landsat satellites with really detailed field measurements from about 600 sites across the Arctic. And so we're able to map out the amount composition of plant matter across the whole biome, but also zoom in and have high enough resolution that we can see the effects of topography, right? Like we can see these little bands of plants in the drainages, for example, in the barren mountaintops. So it really is this amazing new view of the Arctic that has been unlocked in essence by massive international collaboration and advances in computing capabilities. And so we use these new data, for example, to look at how the amount and composition of plant matter changes as you move from the coldest areas on the far left to the warmest areas in the Arctic on the far right. And so the orange line shows the total amount of plant biomass in the plant community. So grams of living plant matter per square meter of plant. And we see that up in the far north, there really aren't many plants. And then as you move up into these warmer areas, it rises up to, coming on 1,500 grams of organic matter per square meter. And then the blue line or the green line shows the proportion of, or it shows the woody plant component, the trees and shrubs. And so in essence, as you move into these warmer areas, you see that much of the plant community becomes dominated by woody plants. With that gray line, the dotted gray line, showing the proportion of the plant community biomass that is associated with woody plants. So such that by the time you hit the warmest parts of the Arctic, something like 75% of the living plant matter is in woody plants. And so based on that, we kind of expect that as the climate warms, ecosystems should move this way, right? You should see more plant matter and you should see more woody plants as well. As I alluded to in the introduction, we see that to some extent. We see that in the Brooks Range, that trees are colonizing the Arctic. People have shown it in the polar Ural Mountains in Russia. So this series of photos from 1962 and 2004 show the same landscape and the expansion of trees across that landscape. Trees growing from low-lying multi-stem plants up to larger, taller, single-stemmed individuals over the 40, 50-year time period between those photos. And a couple years ago, back in, 2020, some colleagues dug into the scientific literature and they synthesized all of the research that looked at changes in tree line across the Arctic. And what they came up with is shown here. So the green dots on this map show where there was a documented advance in tree line. The yellow and red dots then show where tree lines were stable or retreated. And in total, they found that about half the tree lines in the Arctic showed evidence of expansion, whereas the other half were mostly stable with a handful decreasing. So trees aren't necessarily expanding everywhere across the Arctic, across the edge of the boreal forest into the Arctic, but it's happening pretty widely nonetheless. And it's also probably happening in the mountains around Juneau and in Southeast Alaska as well. So people, to my knowledge, haven't really looked at this in the Southeast. But here, for example, is a photo from last summer up outside of Haines, where we have a little spruce up well beyond the altitudinal extent of tree line. Or this little mountain hemlock up on Blackerby Ridge this summer, up above the current extent of mature trees. So trees are also probably expanding into our Arctic ecosystems around Southeast Alaska. So beyond trees expanding, shrubs are also moving across these Arctic landscapes. So here's a photo from 1948 that was taken by the USGS up on the North Slope. And you can see that dark band running through the drainage, and that's a band of green alder. You also see some alder in the forelands as well. And so my colleague Ken Tape up at UAF went back to the site in 2001, 50 years later, and took this photo. And you can see that the alders have expanded really widely across the drainage and in the forelands as well. And so Ken didn't just go to this site, he went to something like 200 sites across the Arctic, took these repeat photos, and almost all of them showed the similar expansion of deciduous shrubs, dwarf birch, willow, alder, across the landscape. And a couple years ago, I was part of a team that did a similar sort of literature synthesis, dug into the research, and came up with this map. So in this map, what I'm showing with the blue dots are areas where there's a documented expansion of shrubs, increased shrub growth, reproduction, biomass, cover, some aspect of kind of shrubbiness. And you can see that there's a lot of blue dots, right? Across northern Alaska, Canada, kind of this mixed signal in Greenland, and also some evidence in Siberia as well. The areas that have stable, decreasing, or mixed responses are shown in these other colors. And while they occur, that's really not the dominant pattern, right? The dominant pattern that we find is one of shrub expansion. Part of this could be a scientific literature bias in that you're more likely to report research that shows evidence of a change, right? So there is that factor to take into consideration. But nonetheless, there's a lot of evidence that shrubs are expanding across northern lands. However, most of these cases that I've just talked about are based on field ecology, right? Going out into the field year after year, or using some other means of devising changes over time. And so inherently, that's really limited, right? The Arctic is large, it's very logistically inaccessible, it's expensive to do field work in the Arctic, it's hard, it's cold. And so we've turned also to using other tools to understand how the Arctic is changing. And one of those really important tools are Earth observing satellites. So these are satellites that are launched and maintained by groups like NASA, the USGS, and NOAA, really key federal employees that do crucial work in helping us understand and manage our global resources. And one of the ways that we can use Earth observing satellites is by looking at what we call vegetation greenness. And so this is a metric that takes into consideration, in essence, how the landscape is reflecting red and near infrared wavelengths. I had an equation on there, and I deleted it half an hour ago because I figured it wasn't really that exciting. But that is to say, like, vegetation greenness is kind of this indicator of plant productivity. We know from a lot of different work that it tracks the gross photosynthesis of plants, the annual rates of productivity, to some degree how much living plant matter there is. And it's a metric that you can derive using a suite of satellites, including satellites that were designed by NOAA back in the 80s to look at meteorology. And so ecologists realized that you could use these satellite measurements of vegetation greenness to understand long-term changes in plant productivity. And so as part of the NOAA Arctic Report Card in 2024, this is just one of like a bajillion examples that I could have drawn on, but the nice thing about the Arctic Report Card is that it comes out every year, and so it provides an annual update as to the status of conditions in the Arctic. So I've been a co-author on this chapter, the Tundra Greens chapter, for about 6 years. And so what we're showing in the figure on the left, in essence, are the long-term changes here from 1982 to 2023 in the maximum summer greenness. Just how absolutely green does the landscape get each summer? We're tracking that over time. So in this figure, the shades of darker green show where there's been the largest changes in vegetation greenness. And so we see these pronounced greening trends, as we call them, across much of North America and Eurasia as well. There's kind of a splattering of what we call browning trends, decreases in productivity over time in parts of the Canadian high Arctic and Siberian. But by and large, we find that about 40% of the Arctic shows evidence of this long-term greening trend since the 1980s. And reassuringly, we don't just see it with these AVHR satellites that were designed for meteorology applications, but we also see it, for example, with the MODIS satellites that NASA designed for, in particular, monitoring Earth's terrestrial ecosystems. And so this is a different time series that goes from 2000 to 2024, but we see largely similar patterns emerging from this totally separate set of satellites. Now, vegetation greenness is really a useful metric to track. It's something that we can drive using kind of legacy satellites, but also always leaves a little something to be desired, right? We know it's kind of like this indicator of plantiness, but what does that mean, you know? And so I recently, a couple years ago, got a project funded through the NASA Early Career Investigation to map the amount composition of plant biomass and how it's changed over the last 2 decades. And so we are in the process of publishing this work now. And in essence, what we find is that from 2000 to 2020, the total amount of plant matter in the Arctic increased by about 14%. The figure on the left shows kind of the spatial patterns of change. And we find that about 25% of the landscape shows this increase in the amount of living plant matter. The areas in gray, or sorry, in pink and purple, are where there is a long-term decrease in plant biomass. We pretty much only find that in the Eastern Siberian lowlands and a very targeted place on the landscape that experience disturbances. And it turns out that almost all of that increase in above ground biomass is due to increased woody plant dominance in these systems. So the expansion of trees and shrubs across northern landscape, which is what we're showing here. Changes in woody dominance over that 20-year time period. Now, if we take those satellite measurements, the vegetation greenness, average them across the Arctic, and we look at how those averages change over time, we see this long-term green trend. So that black line, you see it has this general tendency up and to the right since 1985. We do see this really pronounced dip in 1992, which was due to the eruption of Mount Pinatubo. So Mount Pinatubo, again, threw a whole bunch of ash into the atmosphere, things cooled way down, right? And so when we compare these annual measurements of Arctic-wide average greenness against how warm the Arctic was during that year, what we find is that warmer years tend to be a lot greener. You know, that's not really surprising, but we're able to show it quantitatively, which is really important. And so here, what I've done is I've taken each year from 1985 to 2016 and plotted them out and color coded the points by the decade in which the observation occurred. And we see in essence this shift from the 1980s in light blue to the 90s in 80s in dark blue to the 90s in light blue to the 2000s in orange and up into red for the 2010s, right? With 1992 being the coldest and the brownest year in the Arctic during that time, and 2016 being the hottest and the greenest on record. So we know that climate warming and Arctic greening are connected, right? But that still begs the question, like, how? What are the mechanisms at play? And this is where things, to some degree, get really complex, right? Because there's a lot of different biogeochemical, demographic, ecological dynamics that connect or disconnect climate warming and Arctic greening, right? So we know that climate warming is thawing permafrost. As the permafrost thaws, it releases nitrogen and other nutrients into the soil profile. Plants are able to take that up, use it to grow more leaves and to photosynthesize a greater amount, and that leads to some of these green trends. Yeah, but we've also found through some of our plant biomass change assessments that snow plays a really important role. So for plant biomass to increase, what we found there was that you need to be in an environment that has a persistent winter snowpack that protects the plants from the harsh, cold winter temperatures. And then that snow needs to go away in spring. And then where plant biomass increases is where then you see places where the growing season has become longer and it's become more. But it needs to have the winter back to protect it. Now we should anticipate that further greening is going to come down the pipeline as the Arctic continues to warm. That's kind of a quick summary of kind of the vegetation changes that we see. And not surprisingly, there's a number of winners and losers when it comes to wildlife, right? So for example, caribou and reindeer doing really bad in the Arctic these days, generally. In contrast with beaver and moose, which are kind of boreal forest adjacent species that seem to be on the ascension in parts of the Arctic. So caribou populations, for instance, have declined by 65% or more in the last 2 decades. There are some populations that are doing okay, like the porcupine caribou herd up here at the boundary between Alaska and Canada. But some of the populations, like the George River caribou herd in eastern Canada and the Bathurst herd in western Canada, have declined by like over 95% during that time. And it's not very likely that they're going to bounce back. And there's a bunch of different reasons that caribou might be in decline, right? So as the climate's warm, as we talked about, there's some expansion of woody trees and shrubs. Those plants can outcompete lichen, which are a crucial food for caribou during winter in particular. So that could be like a nutritional stress for caribou. But there's also effects related to, for example, like the shift from snow to rain. So with increasing occurrence of rain on snow events, rain can come in when you have a period of enormous warmth during winter, and then temperatures drop and it freezes solid, and that can, in essence, lock the pasture in ice. And so there have been these large caribou die-offs across the Arctic due to these rain on snow events that lock the food away in the sheet of ice. And then the Arctic is also getting progressively busier, right? More and more people are in the Arctic, building roads, mining development, and caribou are really, really sensitive to those impacts of industrial development. So in contrast with caribou, beaver are doing great. So my colleague, again, Ken Tate up at UAF, he recently mapped out the extent of beaver ponds and lodges across northwestern Alaska, and he identified about 11,000 of these beaver ponds, with the dotted line being kind of the northern extent. And so it turns out that beaver have only kind of just shown up in the last 50 years or so across northern Alaska. So the figure on the left shows the number of beaver dams per 100 square kilometers around Kotzebue from 2000 up to 2020. And you see that in essence around 2000, there weren't beaver in Kotzebue. And by 2020, the population has exploded exponentially to the point that there's now about a beaver dam every square kilometer, right? And so as beavers come in, they build these dams, they build these lodges, they impound a lot of water on the surface. And that water, can make it challenging to navigate streams and rivers. It affects water quality, it changes habitat for fish and wildlife. It has like all these impacts on permafrost, for example, as well, methane emissions. There's all sorts of impacts that come from having this expansion of beaver. Moose also are doing really well nowadays. So moose are a species that rely heavily on woody plants, willow, and back in the late 1800s, they occurred south of the Brooks Range. And in essence, with each progressive decade, they stepped north into the west, such that they cleared through the Seward Peninsula in the 1970s and made it up to, in essence, the Northern Plains in 2009, right? So they've really expanded as these shrubby riparian corridors around lakes and rivers have become shrubbier with willows and other plants. It's allowed moose to push north in response. Such that, like in 2020, there's this article in the Arctic Sounder about a man in Ukjavik, the very northernmost point on the north slope of Alaska, who harvested a moose that showed up unexpectedly far from its northern range. And the long-term wildlife biologist was quoted saying, "Bear probably had the furthest northern moose in the world that day," and it was immediately shot. And so it provides some degree of, there's a food resource that is coming in. But to the degree that that can make up for caribou decline is probably pretty questionable. But we should anticipate that there's going to be a lot more moose on the North Slope in the coming years. So the shrub habitat extent for moose in 2010 is shown in these dark green. And then the projected habitat for 2090, the kind of climate change baked in, is shown in these lighter shades of green. So it's likely that moose will continue to expand across the north. And then you thought you'd only get good mountain goat photos from Kevin White. Well, happened to see this mountain goat at Herbert Glacier 2 days ago. Who just popped out while we were doing field work, just popped out like 20 or 30 feet away and stood there instead. So I couldn't not put it in the presentation. But it also, I think, brings back the idea that these changes in shrub dynamics and tree line expansion are also things that are happening in the mountains around Juneau, right? And those sorts of things are going to impact our charismatic animals like mountains, right? But I would say that we don't really have a clear understanding of how or why or when those sorts of impacts will occur. Okay, so let's wrap this up. So we know that in the Arctic, there's 4 million people or so, coming from about 40 different unique cultural groups. And a lot of the people that live in the north rely really very heavily on tundra landscapes, right? It's a place for people who have lived for millennia, and it provides the source of food and cultural value that makes these places home. And so changes in vegetation affect the availability of berries, affects the availability of mushrooms, it affects wildlife availability and harvest opportunities for communities in the far north. It affects how people can use and move across the landscape, right? So there's a lot of direct impacts that these sorts of vegetation and wildlife and permafrost changes have on northern communities. But these changes also extend farther out of the Arctic. So, I talked about how the Arctic is green, the amount of living plant matter has increased 14% in the last 2 decades. That indicates that plants are taking up and storing more carbon in their bodies than they have in the past. And so that's kind of signified by that green arrow. Those plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But ironically, at the same time, the higher temperatures have led to a lot of permafrost thaw and increased fire activity, such that now the amount of carbon being emitted out of the landscape actually exceeds the amount that plants are taking up, such that the Arctic has turned into probably a net source of carbon to the atmosphere. So that is a positive feedback that accentuates warming, that doesn't just stay in the Arctic, that moves out into the global climate system. Another climate feedback worth noting is related to how reflective the landscape is. So if you have a tundra landscape without trees, a lot of the incoming solar radiation gets bounced back into space. But when you add woody plants that are dark, especially during times of snow, they absorb a lot more incoming sunlight. And that absorption of sunlight warms the landscape and acts as another positive feedback to warming. All right. So these are factors that kind of accentuate warming as the ecosystems change currently. And so that'll be important for how the climate system evolves going into the future. But what will probably be the most important is kind of carbon emissions from people. And so here's a table that I pulled from a recent report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where they ran this whole sequence of current generation ecosystem or Earth system models to look at how the climate system might evolve in the coming years. If we kind of get our act together and pull global carbon emissions down to net zero, we're likely still to see over 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperatures just due to the beaver dynamics already in play. If we kind of go hog wild and live for today, then we're likely to see something more like a 7 degree increase in global temperatures with a fair bit of range. This is kind of the range amongst the current generation of climate models. So we better hope that we're not up here when we think we're here. But either way, it's a whole lot of warming. But the Arctic, either way, is going to see way, way more warming. And so even at net zero, it's likely that there will be a 4+ degree increase in temperatures. Whereas if we double CO2 concentrations, It's likely to be more like 18 to maybe even 27, which is like we turned into a tropical paradise or something. So yeah, so the Arctic is really like kind of this bellwether of global climate change. So what can be done, right? So I think that like the most fundamental thing is that as people, we need to support local to international efforts to reduce carbon emissions. Like that is just fundamentally what it comes down to. Like we can't cap and trade our way out, we can't carbon market our way out of it. We have to figure out ways of using less energy and produce energy more efficient. Right. And it's a wicked problem. It's something that we've like built humanity upon the use of fossil fuels. So it's not an easy thing to change. But it's something that if we want to avoid kind of the most expensive, worst consequences, we need to figure out how to do it. Yeah, we should also be supporting efforts to monitor and predict climate change impacts, right? We need federal employees who are going out and making long-term measurements to understand how the world's working. We need to have people that can anticipate what's coming down the pipeline. Because we have to be able to adapt and respond to these changes in a way that is efficient and effective, right? They're going to be expensive. And if we can do it in a smart way, we can minimize the suffering, the cost of those efforts. So altogether, we find that Arctic is rapidly warming, it's thawing. We see the Arctic is greening as trees and shrubs and other plants kind of expand across northern lands. Wildlife and human communities are being impacted by these changes. And really the Arctic serves as this bellwether for the impacts of climate change, right? They're happening first and perhaps most pronouncedly in the Arctic. But these are also changes that are happening to ecosystems around the world as well. So I would just like to kind of acknowledge the amazing Arctic research community that kind of helped build the story that I shared tonight. And my colleagues, Dr. Katie Orndal and Scott Getz at NAU, who have been really invaluable in kind of the work that I've done in the last 7-8 years. And also acknowledge our funding from NASA and the National Science Foundation. And then thank all of you for being tax-paying people who presumably support science. Thank you for what you do and for being here tonight. Yeah.
We would love to do some questions, and as usual, we will do some running around with microphones. We'll have you ask your questions into a microphone. Let me grab another one. I've got one right over here. I'm gonna come to you first. I'm gonna test this one too. Testing. Whoa, okay, I gotta have my.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Sometimes when we look at the description of the problem, it seems sort of hopeless. But actually, we should all read Bill McKibben's new book, Here Comes the Sun. Because the technology of solar, wind, batteries, we can actually address these issues with today's technology. We don't need fusion to suddenly appear. And so it's a very interesting book. We should all read it. It'll make you feel better. There's lots to do, but a lot of it's political. It's like getting leadership to not go back to coal and stop wind projects off the East Coast and local zoning ordinances to allow solar, things like that we can do. Anyway, a great book. You should read it. A great presentation, but there is, so it's not hopeless.
Thank
you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Logan, this is a question for you from Eric, who's online, who wants to know why are oceans darker in the areas where Arctic ice has receded?
So ocean water just has a lower albedo, a lower reflectivity than bright ice, right? Like if you imagine going out onto an ice sheet, right? It's going to be super bright. You have to have sunglasses on to not be blinded, right? But you can go stand by the ocean and maybe not be as blinded if it's sunny, right?
Oh, so it's not darker than other water, it's just darker than ice.
It's darker than ice.
Got it.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry if that was not clear. It's just darker than ice. Yeah.
Speaking with the water, I know this isn't your area, but when the water is exposed, does that create increased plant life under the ocean?
I believe it does, yeah. Yeah, right, like it fuels increasing algae production, right, and that has effects on phytoplankton. Sorry, leaning into the marine biologists in the room, but there's definitely people here that can speak more to that, more intelligently to that than myself, such as Dr. Jamie Wall.
Thanks, Logan. Good job. And do we understand why the Arctic is warming faster than other places in the world?
I think that there is quite a bit of evidence that it's associated, right, with land surface changes primarily. Right, sea ice decline, some degree in expansion of trees and shrubs that accentuate that warming as well. But there could also be other atmospheric effects, which I'm not an atmospheric scientist, and I'm not necessarily one to get into the details of the application. But I think the sea ice decline is one that is acknowledged as a really important amplification of Arctic warming.
I think you mentioned some of your expeditions that you did with other international colleagues and a few of them in Siberia. And I'm kind of curious, if any of your colleagues, your Russian colleagues, giving similar lectures in their libraries in Siberia now, are they saying the same thing as you all? Or is there anything maybe different that might be worth pointing out, or a different take on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, it's been about a decade since I've worked in Siberia, and so I'm not entirely sure what those folks are saying or doing at this point in time. But I think that these are the sorts of changes that are occurring in widely, right? Trees and shrubs expanding, Siberia is definitely greening. There's not many moose in Siberia, so I don't think that is much of a story. I'm not sure about beaver showing up in Siberia either. So the wildlife changes that I know are definitely more Alaska, but they definitely have caribou there, so those caribou are particularly popular. And there's a lot of those in Russia. There's really excellent scientists in Russia who have to work within, the political and financial confines.
We've got one here, and then George, I'll have you go after that.
Thank you so much for talking with us today. I'm wondering what's next for your research. What's the next thing you want to find out and look at?
I am still kind of like looking around and trying to figure out like where I fit best in China. But one of the things that I am interested in exploring are berries. I think berries, like blueberries, are an important nexus of kind of forest ecology, community health and food security that has a climate control. And it feels very tangible, I think, in this moment where kind of actionable science is more to be funded and supported. So that's kind of the first place that I anticipated. But I think looking at tree line, shrub expansion, and the greening of post-glacial landscapes, trying to understand impacts of these changes on wildlife that not goods are all topics that we will
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. 3 quick questions. How do ocean currents impact the warming of the Arctic? Second question is, how does the Antarctic compare to the Arctic? And my last question is, how have some of the budget cuts and some of the organizations that are critical to what you do, especially satellites and NOAA and SF, going to impact 2025 report card? Over.
Yeah, great questions. I'm not an ocean current scientist, and unfortunately I can't really speak to that aspect of it. I'm definitely a terrestrial ecologist person. So defer to others who might have better insight into that. Including
We've got some in the room.
Yeah.
We can talk after.
Yeah, you can
Nicole Picata, one of our. So we got total clothes, I keep doing it, until me over there, red hair. I'll introduce the two of you after the talk.
New professor of earth science.
Also a first year professor with us, so super excited, sorry, I gotta keep doing it between the two Nicoles.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
so
in terms of
what about
Antarctica,
Antarctica?
yeah, so Antarctica, doesn't have vascular plants. And so there's not kind of expansion of trees and shrubs across those landscapes. There are owl communities that, and some like little incipient vascular plant communities that seem to be establishing and spreading possibly to some extent. I really haven't focused on the Antarctic. I think just staying on top of the Arctic has been challenging enough. And then funding, funding is always a challenge. But fortunately, in the last 5 years or so, there's been pretty good support for Arctic research. A lot of those programs have ended recently, kind of by design. They weren't axed. That was just kind of the natural ending of their lifespan. But whether or not they'll be replaced with new programs is a big question. And I think the direction that the National Science Foundation and NASA go, under the administration is probably not going to be in strong support of Arctic science. Like that seems unlikely. But I think we have to kind of wait and see what the budgets look like, because I think there's a lot of concern with the first Trump administration, and then not much really happened in terms of slashing support for NASA or the National Science Foundation. So long as you remove the EPA, the budgets weren't hit all that hard. So I think we have to kind of wait and see what comes down the pipeline. I think there's a lot of talk, but we'll see if the numbers hit.
That is another hand. No more questions. Thank you, it's really interesting. I'm not sure exactly how to answer or ask this question, but I think with like the increased polarization of just the way people are thinking about different things like climate change, what are your strategies to deal with, I don't know, is it like depoliticizing the issue and like the serious matters that we're facing? Like, what are your strategies to deal with that?
That's a great question. Like, how do we? I guess I don't really see, climate change as being something that should be a political issue, right? Fundamentally, it's a pollution thing, right? That we kind of built political sides around, but it's a pollution issue that, I recognize that there's this fundamental role, this importance that fossil fuels have played in society, right? And getting people to where they're at, the standard of living we have. But at the same time, there are these adverse consequences that come with it that we need to pay attention to. At least they just kind of grow and become increasingly problematic. So I think like recognizing the important role that they played in the past, but also trying to understand pathways forward that don't leave people behind, that kind of promote an equitable, inclusive future. It's hard though. Yeah.
We've got one over there and then one over here.
Thank you, good work. Several questions. How do you explain to yourself and to other people tipping points? What is your concept of what that means? Especially as we are seeing it unfolding in the permafrost.
Yeah.
The positive feedbacks. And secondly, a few slides ago, you showed Roman numeral 3, which was adaptation. How do you deal with the conundrum between adaptation and mitigation? We're not doing well at mitigation, so why don't we just give up and adapt and we'll all live underground? Where our changes in the way.
Yeah.
And third, you mentioned leadership. We have the opportunity to be leaders right here at Juneau. We're in the midst of the comprehensive plan for the city and borough of Juneau. And we could be a far different community than we are now, totally dependent on personal cars for transportation, for example. Maybe we should be riding the rails instead. Sorry to overwhelm your question.
Yeah. So tipping points. I have not really taught students about tipping points at this point in time. I've honestly not taught very much. I've mostly been a research scientist over my career so far, and so I'm still very much learning how to teach. But tipping points being these cases where environmental conditions reach a point where things just kind of fall. Right, so you can think about that in terms of permafrost thaw, right, these big ice wedges that form the structural stability of the landscape. There's a tipping point when that ice reaches above freezing and it goes away, and that landscape sloughs off, like that's a tipping point, right? It's not, that landscape is not built down anytime soon. Or there could be tipping points in, you know, you think about that with trees showing up in these new landscapes, right? At some point, there's so many mature trees putting out so many new cones that it might really take off and to get new forest that is suddenly popping up. Sorry, what's your second question?
Adaptation.
Oh, adaptation versus mitigation. Both are important, right? I mean, I would say that fundamentally mitigation is the thing that it should be focused on. Just figure out ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This is the key activity. But also at the same time, we have to be figuring out ways of anticipating what's coming and building our systems to be resilient to those changes. So I don't necessarily think it's an either or. It's like we need to be focused on all these things simultaneously. And then Juneau's in a unique position, right? We're kind of a contained community that has hydro, has a tremendous potential for electric vehicles and heat pumps and kind of ways of producing energy in a way that is very clean. Isn't in this case deleterious to fish, for example, as damming other rivers would be in other places. And so I think that you're right, there are great opportunities for Juneau to be kind of leader in that realm, and also being at the edge of the Arctic.
And we're also on an elevator rising from the center of the earth faster than sea level.
And we're rising, yeah. As the glaciers have gone away, the land is rising up, and so we might to some degree escape the effects of rising sea level that a lot of other places experience.
Logan, we're going to do one more question, which is right here. Those of you, after we have our last question, I know that Logan will stick around for a couple of minutes, and then again, we have a couple more scientists in the room. I know those of you who had ocean questions, we have another scientist over there, Nicole, I just got a spot, Nicole is willing to stick around also. So one more question right here.
Okay, I gotta make it important, I guess. Okay, I'm just wondering, you know, if you had a really big budget, if money was not a question for research, what would you do?
Oh man. Like I'm so used to living in my tiny constrained world. Yeah. I don't know. Sorry, I wish I had a great answer. Yeah.
Is there equipment that you want? I want research. Is there a new like research endeavor is there a place you travel? Is there where would you fly? Where would you go? What's the next thing? Is there a piece of equipment you need to go?
I am excited to be working in Southeast Alaska. Like I think I've spent my time working in the Arctic and I want to work here. And so I would, you know, take some time to figure out what's most needed and what I could best.
Do you need your own helicopter?
No.
Get it go.
Yeah. Fleet of smart stops. Yeah. I'll have to ask ChatGPT like it.
Thank you for that. Too many of you said no constraint. My brain is working. So thank you all so much. What a great audience.